This is a shipping container. It's 40 feet long, 8 feet wide, weighs approximately 4 tons empty, and can hold 26 tons of cargo. There are roughly 50 million of these containers circulating through global trade at any given moment. The one you're looking at contains automotive parts manufactured in Guangzhou, destined for a Volkswagen factory in Wolfsburg, Germany. Under normal routing, this container travels 21,000 kilometers through the Strait of Malacca, around India, through the Suez Canal, across the Mediterranean, and up to Hamburg. The journey takes 35 to 40 days. On January 15, 2026, this container took a different route. It traveled 12,800 kilometers from Guangzhou to Rotterdam through the Bering Strait, along the northern coast of Russia, past Murmansk, and into the Atlantic. The journey took 23 days. The fuel cost was 40% lower. The transit fees were 60% of Suez rates. And every nautical mile of that Arctic passage fell under the sovereign jurisdiction of a single nation, the Russian Federation. The Northern Sea Route is not new. Soviet icebreakers carved it open in the 1930s. What's new is that climate change has transformed it from a seasonal curiosity into a commercially viable alternative to the routes that have defined global shipping for 150 years. And on January 18, 2026, Vladimir Putin signed Federal Law 2026-0012, establishing the legal and military infrastructure to ensure that Russia captures the entirety of the $3 trillion in annual trade value that will eventually flow through Arctic waters. This is not a shipping lane. This is the new center of global commerce, and one nation just seized permanent control. Here's what they're not telling you. The economics of the Northern Sea Route were impossible a decade ago. Arctic ice coverage made navigation dangerous from October through June, limiting the shipping window to 4 months. Insurance rates for Arctic passages exceeded 300% of standard maritime coverage. Icebreaker escort was required for vessels without ice-class ratings, adding $300,000 or more per transit. The route saved time, but cost more than the savings justified. Those economics have inverted. Arctic summer ice coverage has declined 40% since 2000. The navigation window has expanded from 4 months to 8 months, with some projections showing year-round viability by 2035. Insurance rates have fallen to 140% of standard coverage as the route's safety record improves. And Russia has invested $32 billion in infrastructure that eliminates the barriers that once made Suez preferable. The Suez Canal handles approximately 12% of global trade, $1.3 trillion annually. It charges $700,000 on average for a laden container ship transit. The canal is 193 kilometers long and cannot be widened further without destroying the Egyptian cities built along its banks. When the Ever Given blocked the canal for 6 days in 2021, the global economy lost an estimated $9.6 billion per day in delayed shipments. The Northern Sea Route is 5,600 kilometers of open water with no single choke point, no capacity constraint, and no physical limit on the number of vessels that can transit simultaneously. As ice continues retreating, the route's capacity becomes effectively unlimited, bounded only by the port infrastructure at either end and the availability of vessels rated for polar conditions. At 9:30 a.m. Moscow time on January 16th, the Russian Ministry of Transport published revised transit regulations for the Northern Sea Route Administration. The regulations require all vessels transiting Russian Arctic waters to register with Russian maritime authorities 45 days in advance, carry Russian ice pilots aboard during designated ice periods, use Russian icebreaker escort when directed, pay transit fees calibrated to vessel displacement and cargo value, and submit to Russian inspection at any point during passage. These are not extraordinary requirements by maritime law standards. Suez has similar mandates. What's extraordinary is the geographic scope. 5.6 million square kilometers of ocean where these rules now apply, covering every practical route between Atlantic and Pacific through Arctic waters. Russia has not merely claimed a shipping lane, it has claimed an ocean. This is where the lie becomes unsustainable. The international legal framework for Arctic navigation rests on the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which establishes the principle of innocent passage, the right of vessels to transit through territorial waters and exclusive economic zones without coastal state interference, provided they don't threaten security or violate local laws. Russia's interpretation of innocent passage in Arctic waters is unique. Under Russian law, the Northern Sea Route falls under Article 234 of UNCLOS, which permits coastal states to adopt special regulations in ice-covered areas to prevent pollution. Russia has expanded this environmental exception into a comprehensive regulatory regime that requires permission rather than merely permitting passage. The United States does not recognize Russia's interpretation. American naval vessels have conducted freedom of navigation operations through the Northern Sea Route 4 times since 2019, asserting that international waters remain international, regardless of Russian claims. But naval vessels don't carry cargo. Commercial shipping follows routes where insurance is available, where ports provide services, and where regulatory frameworks are predictable, even if those frameworks are controlled by states the cargo owners might prefer to avoid. On January 12, 2026, Lloyd's of London announced revised underwriting guidelines for Northern Sea Route transits. The guidelines require vessels to comply with Russian maritime regulations as a condition of coverage. Non-compliant vessels, including those conducting freedom of navigation commercial transits, will be denied insurance for Arctic passages. Insurance is the mechanism through which Russia's legal claims become commercial reality. A shipping company can reject Russian jurisdiction in principle while accepting it in practice, because the alternative is uninsured vessels that no port will accept and no bank will finance. Russia doesn't need international recognition of its Arctic authority. It needs commercial compliance, and commercial compliance is now mandatory. When institutions do this, they're not managing risk, they're containing disaster. The strategic implications of Russian Arctic control extend far beyond shipping fees. On January 14, 2026, Rosatom, Russia's state nuclear corporation, announced completion of the 5th Arktika-class nuclear icebreaker, bringing the fleet to 7 vessels capable of year-round Arctic operation. No other nation operates more than 2 nuclear icebreakers. The United States operates 0. Its only heavy icebreaker, the Polar Star, is 48 years old and scheduled for decommissioning in 2027. Nuclear icebreakers are not merely ships. They are infrastructure, mobile platforms that create navigable channels through ice that would otherwise stop commercial traffic entirely. A nation that controls icebreaker capacity controls which vessels can transit Arctic waters and when. Russia's 7-vessel nuclear fleet can support continuous commercial operations across the entire Northern Sea Route. No competitor can match this capacity before 2035 at the earliest. The icebreaker gap is compounded by port infrastructure. Russia has constructed or modernized 14 deep-water ports along its Arctic coastline since 2018, with combined cargo handling capacity exceeding 200 million tons annually. Sabetta, the flagship Arctic port, can simultaneously service 15 LNG carriers and process 30 million tons of liquefied gas per year. Murmansk's expansion, completed in December 2025, added container handling facilities that can process 1.5 million TEUs annually, more than the entire current Northern Sea Route traffic. The infrastructure investment totals $47 billion over 8 years, funded primarily through the National Wealth Fund and Chinese development financing. This spending occurred while Western analysts dismissed the Northern Sea Route as a climate-dependent gamble with uncertain returns. The gamble has paid off. The returns are becoming visible, and the competitive window for alternative infrastructure has closed. Less than 5 years remain before the Northern Sea Route becomes the preferred Asia-Europe shipping corridor by pure economics. Once that threshold is crossed, the infrastructure advantages Russia has built become permanent, network effects that make alternatives progressively less viable even if Arctic ice somehow returned. While one side debates, the other side builds. China's role in Russia's Arctic strategy is not passive investment, but active partnership. On January 10, 2026, COSCO Shipping, China's state-owned maritime giant, announced orders for 12 ice-class container vessels specifically designed for Northern Sea Route operations. The vessels will be constructed at Chinese shipyards using Russian ice navigation specifications, creating a fleet that can transit Arctic waters without icebreaker escort during the extended navigation season. The order represents a $4.2 billion bet that Arctic shipping will capture a significant share of China-Europe trade within the decade. COSCO's current Asia-Europe capacity runs approximately 400 vessels through Suez. 12 Arctic-capable ships is a pilot program, not a fleet replacement. But pilot programs become standard operations when they prove economically superior, and the economics are already favorable. Maersk, the world's largest container shipping company, has not ordered ice-class vessels. Neither has MSC, CMA CGM, or any Western shipping conglomerate. The capital expenditure required, $350 million per ice-class vessel versus $150 million for conventional container ships, cannot be justified without confidence in Arctic route viability. Western companies see the same economics as COSCO, but lack the strategic mandate to invest ahead of commercial proof. This creates a structural advantage that compounds over time. Chinese vessels will gain operational experience on Arctic routes, while Western competitors wait for market validation. Chinese crews will develop ice navigation expertise, while Western maritime academies continue training for traditional routes. Chinese shipping rates will reflect infrastructure investments already made, while Western rates must eventually incorporate catch-up capital expenditure. By 2032, COSCO projects operating 50 ice-class vessels on Arctic routes, capturing 15% of Asia-Europe container traffic. At that scale, the competitive pressure on Suez-dependent carriers becomes existential. The route that seemed optional becomes mandatory, and mandatory means operating under Russian rules. On January 17th, the Shanghai Shipping Exchange announced a new freight index specifically for Northern Sea Route containers, the first formal price discovery mechanism for Arctic cargo. Index creation precedes market development. The index exists because Chinese authorities expect a market large enough to require standardized pricing. That market is Russia's monopoly to regulate. The mathematics of the trap are now inescapable. Western nations face a configuration of disadvantages that no policy can reverse on relevant timelines. Disadvantage 1. Geography. The Northern Sea Route runs entirely through Russian territorial waters and exclusive economic zones. There is no alternative Arctic passage that avoids Russian jurisdiction. The Northwest Passage through Canadian waters remains ice-choked, navigationally hazardous, and decades away from commercial viability. The transpolar route across the central Arctic Ocean requires ice-class vessels that don't exist in commercial fleets and won't exist until after Russia's position is entrenched. Disadvantage 2. Infrastructure. Building a competitive Arctic shipping network would require ports, icebreakers, search and rescue stations, navigation systems, and crew training facilities across the North American and European Arctic. Canada has one deep-water Arctic port. The United States has none. Greenland's infrastructure is minimal. Norway has commercial Arctic capacity, but not at scales that would enable route competition. The investment required exceeds $100 billion, and the construction timeline exceeds 15 years. Disadvantage 3. Climate trajectory. Arctic ice will continue declining regardless of emissions policy decisions made today. Each degree of warming extends the navigation season, improves route economics, and increases traffic through Russian-controlled waters. The physical conditions that enable Russia's monopoly are not reversible on any human policy timeline. By the time serious infrastructure competition could be operational, the monopoly will have generated 2 decades of revenue and network effects. The trap is that opposing Russia's Arctic control would require investment that Western governments have not authorized, timelines that extend beyond electoral cycles, and acceptance that the competition is for second place in a market Russia will dominate regardless. The alternative, accepting Russian control and paying transit fees, transfers approximately $30 to $50 billion annually to Russian state coffers once the route reaches projected capacity. That's more than Russia currently earns from arms exports, more than its entire pre-war gas revenue from Germany, and entirely insulated from sanctions, because the payments come from commercial shipping that Western economies cannot function without. This is what a system looks like when the choke point has changed hands and no one noticed until the toll booth was already built. The informed are not waiting for official announcements to understand what's happening. Shipping equities have diverged sharply since October 2025. Companies with ice-class vessel capacity or Arctic operational experience have outperformed conventional carriers by 23%. The market is pricing in a route transformation that corporate communications don't yet acknowledge. Suez Canal Authority revenues declined 8% in 2025, despite global trade recovery, reflecting early diversion of traffic to Arctic alternatives. Egyptian government bonds have widened 45 basis points since November, pricing in fiscal risk from a revenue stream that seemed permanent, but now faces structural competition. Physical gold purchases by Russian state entities have accelerated to record levels. 142 tons added to central bank reserves in 2025, funded by energy revenues that sanctions were supposed to eliminate. The purchases reflect confidence in long-term revenue streams that Arctic dominance will provide. Gold doesn't require SWIFT. Gold doesn't require Western banking relationships. Gold converts Arctic tolls into permanent sovereign wealth that no future sanctions can reach. Rare earth shipments from Chinese Arctic mining operations in Greenland have begun transiting the Northern Sea Route directly to processing facilities in Gansu Province, bypassing the traditional Pacific routing entirely. The shipments are small, approximately 12,000 tons annually, but they demonstrate that Arctic transit works for high-value cargo with time-sensitive delivery requirements. What works for rare earths will work for electronics, automotive parts, and every other category of Asia-Europe trade. Insurance premiums for Northern Sea Route transits have declined 15% year over year, while Suez premiums have increased 12% following Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. The risk calculus is inverting. Arctic waters under Russian naval protection are becoming safer than traditional routes through contested regions. Safety differentials drive commercial decisions faster than political preferences. The question is not whether the Northern Sea Route becomes a major shipping corridor. The question is who understands that transformation well enough to position for its consequences. A 40-foot container traveling 12,800 kilometers instead of 21,000, 23 days instead of 35, 40% less fuel, 60% lower fees, and every mile of that shorter, cheaper, faster route, controlled by a single nation that has spent 2 decades building the infrastructure to capture it. This is not a trade route. This is the architectural foundation of a new global logistics order, one where the passage between the world's 2 largest economies runs through Russian waters, under Russian rules, paying Russian fees. Physics doesn't negotiate. ICE doesn't recognize sanctions. And reality, eventually, asserts itself over every strategy that assumed the map would stay the same. The divergence between traditional shipping economics and Arctic shipping economics is no longer theoretical. What happens next is not prediction. It's 5.6 million square kilometers of ocean that just became the most valuable real estate on Earth.